The soft glow of early morning light filtered through the tall windows of the Grand Plaza Hotel's lobby. At this hour, the marble floors gleamed with perfect clarity, not a fingerprint or scuff mark in sight. That's exactly how Carlos Mendez liked it. He ran his well-worn cloth over the brass railing of the grand staircase one final time and stepped back to admire his work. For 15 years, Carlos had arrived at the hotel at 4 a.m., long before the guests stirred from their luxurious beds. He knew every corner of the 12-story building like the lines on his palm, from the rooftop garden where wealthy couples held their wedding, receptions to the basement storage rooms where holiday decorations gathered dust most of the year. Carlos had cleaned it all. "Looking good today, Carlos," said Hank, the head of security, passing through the lobby on his morning rounds. Carlos nodded with a slight smile. "Just finished. The morning rush will be here soon." At 52, Carlos moved a bit slower than when he'd first started, but he made up for it with efficiency. Years of experience had taught him exactly how to clean each space with minimal effort and maximum impact. The hotel management appreciated his work, even if most guests never noticed him. Just another man in a gray uniform, part of the background of their lavish stays. He gathered his cleaning supplies and wheeled his cart toward the service elevator. His shift wasn't over yet. The ballrooms needed attention before the day's events began. As he waited for the elevator, he glanced at the framed photographs lining the wall. Pictures of famous guests who had stayed at the Grand Plaza over its 80-year history. Movie stars, politicians, and musicians smiled from behind glass, immortalized in the hotel's legacy. Carlos often wondered what it would be like to be the kind of person who belonged in those golden frames. Not that he was unhappy with his life. He had a small but comfortable apartment, enough money to send home to his mother in Guatemala, and his health. Many people had far less. The elevator arrived with a soft ping, and Carlos pushed his cart inside. As he descended to the mezzanine level, he hummed softly to himself, a habit he'd developed over years of working alone in the quiet morning hours. The Grand Plaza had 3 ballrooms of varying sizes. Today, the largest one, the Crystal Ballroom, was being prepared for a charity gala hosted by the Whitfield Foundation. Carlos had overheard the event planners discussing it earlier in the week. Something about raising money for music education in underfunded schools. When the elevator doors opened, Carlos was surprised to find the hallway already bustling with activity. Florists carried elaborate arrangements of white roses and blue hydrangeas. Caterers wheeled carts loaded with covered dishes. Carlos maneuvered his cleaning cart carefully through the commotion, nodding politely as people stepped aside. Inside the Crystal Ballroom, workers were setting up round tables draped in crisp white linens. A stage had been erected at one end of the room, and technicians tested spotlights and microphones. But what caught Carlos's eye was the grand piano that had been placed center stage, a magnificent instrument, with a glossy black finish that reflected the crystal chandeliers above. Carlos parked his cart in an unobtrusive corner and began his work, dusting the ornate moldings along the walls and polishing the already gleaming floor. As he worked, his eyes kept returning to the piano. He'd seen many pianos during his years at the hotel, but this one seemed special somehow. "It's a Steinway concert grand," said a voice behind him. "Worth about $150,000? Carlos turned to find Mr. Reynolds, the hotel manager, inspecting the room with his clipboard. "It's beautiful," Carlos said simply. "Mrs. Whitfield had it brought in specially for tonight. She'll be playing it during the gala." Mr. Reynolds checked something off his list. "Make sure everything is spotless, Carlos. The Whitfields are our most important clients." "Yes, sir. Always." After Mr. Reynolds left, Carlos continued his cleaning, working his way closer to the stage. The room gradually emptied as the various workers completed their tasks and moved on to other preparations. Soon Carlos found himself alone in the vast ballroom. He glanced at his watch. He still had 30 minutes before he needed to move on to the next ballroom. The piano drew his gaze like a magnet. Without fully realizing what he was doing, Carlos climbed the 3 steps to the stage and stood beside the magnificent instrument. His fingers hovered over the keys, not quite touching. For as long as he could remember, Carlos had been fascinated by music. As a child in Guatemala, he'd listened to his grandfather play folk songs on an old guitar, watching carefully how the man's fingers formed different shapes on the strings. In his 20s, when he'd first come to America, Carlos had sometimes stopped outside music stores to watch pianists demonstrate instruments to potential buyers. But it wasn't until 5 years ago, when smartphones and YouTube became part of his life, that Carlos had begun to learn music himself. After his long shifts at the hotel, he would return to his apartment, prop his phone on his kitchen table, and follow along with free piano lessons online. Without an actual piano, he'd drawn a keyboard on cardboard, practicing finger positions and movements in silence. Later, he'd discovered that the community center near his apartment had an old upright piano that nobody used. The director had been happy to let Carlos practice there during off hours. Twice a week for the past 3 years, Carlos had spent his evenings at that worn-out piano, teaching himself to play. Now, standing before this masterpiece of an instrument, Carlos felt a pull he couldn't resist. He looked around the empty ballroom once more, then sat down carefully on the bench. He placed his hands on the keys, feeling their cool smoothness beneath his calloused fingers. He began to play softly, a simple melody he'd been practicing for months. Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. The notes rang out with a clarity and richness he'd never experienced on the community center's old piano. Carlos closed his eyes, losing himself in the music. In these moments, he wasn't Carlos the janitor anymore. He was simply a man making something beautiful in the world. His hands, which had spent thousands of hours scrubbing floors and polishing surfaces, now created sounds that floated up to the crystal chandeliers and filled the empty ballroom with emotion. He didn't hear the door open at the back of the room, didn't notice the woman who stood watching, her hand frozen on the handle of her designer purse. Only when he finished the piece and opened his eyes did Carlos realize he was no longer alone. Eleanor Whitfield stood at the foot of the stage, her expression unreadable. In her tailored blue suit and pearl necklace, she embodied wealth and privilege. Carlos had seen her before, of course. Her family's events were regularly held at the Grand Plaza, but they had never spoken. "I'm sorry," Carlos said quickly, standing up from the bench. "I was just... Who gave you permission to touch that piano?" Her voice was sharp, cutting through the lingering echoes of the music. Carlos felt heat rise to his face. "No one, ma'am. I apologize. I was cleaning and..." "That instrument was delivered specifically for tonight's gala," she continued, climbing the steps to the stage. "It's not a toy for the hotel staff to play with when no one's looking." Carlos nodded, backing away from the piano. "I understand. It won't happen again." Eleanor inspected the piano as if checking for damage. Her perfectly manicured fingers traced the edge of the fallboard. "Do you have any idea what this costs? More than you make in a year, I imagine." The words stung, but Carlos kept his expression neutral. After 15 years in service jobs, he'd learned to weather occasional humiliation with dignity. "I meant no disrespect," he said quietly. "Music is important to me." Eleanor gave a short laugh. "Music is important to everyone. That's why we're raising money tonight, so children can learn from proper teachers with proper instruments." She looked at him directly for the first time. "Not by sneaking around and touching things that don't belong to them." At that moment, Mr. Reynolds walked into the ballroom, his eyes widening when he saw the scene on stage. He hurried forward. "Mrs. Whitfield, is everything all right?" Eleanor turned to the manager. "I found your janitor playing the piano that was delivered for tonight's performance. I'd appreciate if your staff could show more professionalism." Carlos felt his stomach tighten. He needed this job. His mother's medication wasn't cheap, and at his age, finding new employment wouldn't be easy. "I'm very sorry, Mrs. Whitfield," Mr. Reynolds said, shooting Carlos a warning look. "I assure you it won't happen again. Carlos, please continue your work in the other ballrooms." Carlos nodded, his eyes downcast. "Yes, sir. Right away." He gathered his cleaning supplies and headed toward the door, shame burning in his chest. As he pushed his cart into the hallway, Carlos tried to remind himself of all he had to be thankful for: a steady job, a roof over his head, his health. But the humiliation of the moment clung to him like a shadow. He didn't regret touching the piano, though. For those few minutes, he'd experienced something transcendent, a connection to beauty that made the rest of his life more bearable. No one could take that away from him, not even Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield with all her money and influence. Carlos straightened his shoulders and pushed his cart toward the next ballroom. Tomorrow after his shift, he would go to the community center and practice again. One day, perhaps he would play well enough that no one would question his right to sit at a piano, any piano. Until then, he would continue cleaning, continue learning, continue dreaming, and somewhere deep inside, a small spark of defiance flickered to life, a spark that would, unknown to Carlos, ignite something unexpected when the charity gala began later that evening. The crystal ballroom transformed as evening approached. Hundreds of tiny lights twinkled from the ceiling, creating the illusion of a starry night sky. Guests in expensive suits and glittering dresses began to arrive around 7, filling the room with a gentle hum of conversation and the occasional burst of polite laughter. Carlos watched from a service doorway, his cleaning cart tucked away for the night. He wasn't supposed to be there. His shift had ended hours ago, but he couldn't bring himself to go home. Not after what had happened that morning, not after the music and the humiliation. He'd changed out of his gray uniform into the only dress shirt he owned, a white button-up he saved for special occasions. With his hair combed neatly and his posture straight, he almost looked like he belonged among the hotel staff serving drinks and appetizers. "What are you still doing here?" whispered Rosa, one of the kitchen workers, as she passed by with a tray of champagne flutes. "Just watching," Carlos replied. "The music tonight is supposed to be special." Rosa raised an eyebrow but didn't question him further. Many of the hotel staff stayed longer than required when interesting events took place. It was one of the unspoken perks of the job. Glimpses into a world they could never afford to enter as guests. From his vantage point, Carlos could see the grand piano on stage, spotlights highlighting its perfect glossy surface. The instrument seemed to wait patiently for its moment in the evening's program. Carlos felt a pang of longing just looking at it. The crowd grew as more guests arrived. Carlos recognized several faces: regular hotel patrons, local celebrities, politicians. The wealthy elite of the city gathered to support music education while enjoying an evening of luxury themselves. At 8 o'clock precisely, Eleanor Whitfield stepped onto the stage. The room quieted as she approached the microphone. "Good evening, friends," she began, her voice smooth and practiced. "Thank you all for supporting the Whitfield Foundation's Music for All initiative tonight." Carlos leaned against the doorframe, watching her command the attention of everyone in the room. She wore a midnight blue evening gown that caught the light as she moved, making her seem to shimmer like something not quite real. "Music has the power to transform lives," she continued. "It can lift us out of darkness, give voice to our deepest emotions, and connect us across all boundaries of language and culture." Carlos couldn't help but agree with her words, even as the memory of her dismissive tone from that morning stung fresh in his mind. "Tonight, we hope to raise enough funds to provide instruments and instruction to 20 underfunded schools across our city," Eleanor said. "Every child deserves the chance to experience the joy of making music." The audience applauded enthusiastically. Carlos watched their faces, wondering how many of them truly understood what it meant to hunger for music but have no way to satisfy that hunger. How many had ever been told they didn't belong at the keys of a piano? "Before dinner is served, I'd like to share a piece that means a great deal to me," Eleanor said, moving toward the piano. "My mother taught me to play when I was just 5 years old, and this was the first Chopin piece I mastered." Carlos felt his heart beat faster. Surely it couldn't be. Eleanor sat at the piano, adjusted the microphone near the keys, and began to play. The opening notes of Nocturne in E-flat major filled the ballroom, the same piece Carlos had played that morning. He held his breath, listening intently. Her technique was flawless, each note precisely timed and weighted, but something was missing. The music flowed perfectly from her fingers, but it didn't seem to flow from her heart. It was like listening to a beautiful recording rather than a living, breathing performance. When she finished, the audience erupted in applause. Eleanor smiled graciously, accepting their admiration as her due. Carlos applauded too, respectful of her skill if not moved by her interpretation. "Now," Eleanor said, returning to the standing microphone, "please enjoy your dinner. Our program will continue after the main course, featuring performances from several talented young musicians who have benefited from our foundation's work." As the guests began their meals, Carlos slipped away from his doorway. He walked through the service corridors of the hotel thinking. Something about the evening felt unfinished to him, like a conversation cut short before its natural conclusion. He found himself wandering to the smaller Magnolia Ballroom, which wasn't being used that night. Inside, a baby grand piano sat in the corner, not as magnificent as the Steinway in the Crystal Ballroom, but still a fine instrument. Carlos approached it cautiously, looking over his shoulder to ensure he was alone. When he sat on the bench and placed his hands on the keys, the morning's humiliation seemed to melt away. He began to play, not Chopin this time, but a simple folk melody his grandfather had taught him, one he'd adapted for piano over years of practice. The melody was haunting and sweet, carrying echoes of his childhood in Guatemala, of mountain mists and warm kitchens and family gatherings. Carlos played with his eyes closed, letting the music take him far from the hotel and its rigid hierarchies. He didn't hear the door open. Didn't notice the small group of people who had entered the room until they began to applaud when he finished. Carlos turned, startled. 4 people stood watching him, 2 young men and 2 women, all dressed for the gala. "That was beautiful," said one of the women, stepping forward. "Did you compose it yourself?" "No," Carlos said, standing quickly from the bench. "It's an old song from my country. I just adapted it." "You play with such feeling," said one of the men. He had a musician's keen eyes, observant and appreciative. "Are you one of the performers for tonight's program?" Carlos shook his head. "No, I work here. I'm the morning janitor." The 4 exchanged glances, surprise evident on their faces. "We were just looking for somewhere quiet to talk shop," explained the second woman. "We're all music teachers from the university. But now I'm curious, how did you learn to play like that?" Carlos hesitated, unsure how much to share. But their interest seemed genuine, not mocking. "I taught myself," he said finally. "Videos online. And I practice at the community center near my apartment. They have an old piano no one uses much." The first man whistled softly. "Self-taught? That's impressive. Most people need years of formal instruction to develop that kind of expression." Carlos felt warmth spread through him at the compliment. These were music teachers, professionals, and they thought he played well. "Would you play something else for us?" asked the second man. "We'd love to hear more." Before Carlos could answer, the ballroom door opened again. Mr. Reynolds stood there, his face tightening when he saw Carlos at the piano. "Carlos," he said sharply, "what are you doing here? Your shift ended hours ago." "It's our fault," the first woman said quickly. "We asked him to play for us." "He's very talented." Mr. Reynolds looked unconvinced. "This room is supposed to be closed tonight, and hotel staff are not permitted to use guest facilities even when off duty." He turned to Carlos. "You know the rules." Carlos nodded, the familiar shame returning. "Yes, sir. I was just leaving." "Actually," said the second man, "we were hoping to bring him back to the gala with us. As our guest." Mr. Reynolds blinked in surprise. "I don't think that would be appropriate." "Why not?" challenged the first woman. "He's not working now and we're inviting him. Surely there's no rule against that." The hotel manager seemed at a loss. "Well, I suppose technically, but Mrs. Whitfield was already unhappy about an incident this morning involving Mr. Mendez and the piano." "Eleanor Whitfield?" asked the second woman, her eyebrows rising. "She's an old friend of mine from conservatory days." "Let me handle her." Carlos looked between them, hardly daring to hope. To attend the gala, to hear the young musicians play up close instead of from a service doorway, it seemed impossible. "Please," said the first man to Carlos. "Join us. I'd like to talk more about your musical background." After a moment's hesitation, Carlos nodded. "Thank you. I would be honored." The group made their way back to the Crystal Ballroom, Carlos walking slightly behind the 4 musicians, still not quite believing what was happening. Mr. Reynolds followed, looking uncomfortable but unwilling to cause a scene with university faculty members. They entered through the main doors this time, not the service entrance. Heads turned as the group made their way to an empty table near the stage. Carlos felt dozens of curious eyes on him, wondering who he was and why he was there. Among those watching was Eleanor Whitfield. She stood near the stage speaking with the evening's MC when she spotted Carlos taking a seat with the music teachers. Her conversation faltered, her gaze sharpening as she recognized the man who had touched her piano that morning. Carlos saw the moment of recognition on her face, saw her excuse herself from her conversation, and begin walking toward their table. His stomach tightened. The brief joy of being invited to the gala threatened to dissolve into another humiliating confrontation. "Professor Chen," Eleanor said when she reached them, addressing the second woman. "How lovely to see you. I didn't realize you'd be attending tonight." "Last-minute decision?" Professor Chen replied with a warm smile. "We're all so supportive of music education initiatives." Eleanor nodded, then turned her attention to Carlos. "And I see you've brought a guest." The temperature of her voice dropped several degrees on the last word. Carlos straightened in his chair, determined to maintain his dignity despite her obvious disapproval. "Yes," said Professor Chen, either missing or ignoring Eleanor's tone. "We just had the pleasure of hearing Mr. Mendez play in the Magnolia Ballroom. He's remarkably talented." Eleanor's perfectly shaped eyebrows rose slightly. "Is that so?" The first man nodded enthusiastically. His interpretation of a Guatemalan folk song was exquisite. Such emotional depth, we were quite moved. For a moment, Eleanor seemed at a loss for words. She looked at Carlos with new uncertainty, as if seeing him properly for the first time. "Well," she said finally. "How unexpected." The MC approached, touching Eleanor's elbow gently. "Mrs. Whitfield, we're ready to continue the program whenever you are." Eleanor nodded, seeming relieved at the interruption. "Of course. Please excuse me." As she walked away, Carlos let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The confrontation he'd feared hadn't materialized, but the evening was far from over. He sensed that something had shifted, that the neat categories of janitor and wealthy patron had somehow become less solid. What that might mean, he wasn't yet sure. But as the lights dimmed and the first young musician took the stage, Carlos allowed himself to simply be present in the moment, a man among others, sharing in the universal language of music. The young pianist on stage couldn't have been more than 12 years old. She wore a simple blue dress, her hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, and her feet barely reached the pedals of the grand piano. But when she began to play a challenging piece by Mozart, the room fell silent in appreciation. Carlos leaned forward in his chair, captivated. He recognized the technical difficulties the girl was navigating with such apparent ease. Those same passages had given him trouble for months when he'd tried to learn them. "She's one of our scholarship students," whispered Professor Chen beside him. "Started lessons just 2 years ago when our foundation began working with her school." "She's wonderful," Carlos replied softly, watching the girl's small hands move confidently across the keys. When she finished, the audience erupted in applause. Carlos clapped until his palms stung, a strange mixture of admiration and longing washing over him. If he had been given such opportunities as a child, where might he be now? The evening continued with more young performers, a violinist, a cellist, another pianist. Each played with remarkable skill for their age, and each received enthusiastic applause from the wealthy patrons. Between performances, Carlos spoke quietly with the professors at his table. They asked thoughtful questions about his musical journey, listening with genuine interest to his stories of late-night practice sessions and YouTube tutorials. "You've accomplished so much on your own," said Professor Liu, the first man who had spoken to him in the Magnolia Ballroom. "Imagine what you could do with proper instruction." Carlos smiled politely but shook his head. "I'm 52 years old, Professor. A bit late to start a music career." "Nonsense," said Professor Diaz, the second man. "Music isn't only about careers. It's about expression, connection, joy. Those things have no age limit." As they spoke, Carlos noticed Eleanor Whitfield watching their table from across the room. Her expression was difficult to read. Not quite the disapproval from earlier, but something more complex. Curiosity, perhaps, or confusion. The MC returned to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a special treat to close our student showcase. The Whitfield Youth Orchestra will now perform Beethoven's Ode to Joy under the direction of Maestro Patel." A group of 20 children and teenagers filed onto the stage, carrying various instruments. They arranged themselves in semicircular rows, adjusting music stands and tuning strings. At the center of the front row stood a small boy with a flute, looking nervous but determined. "That's Miguel," Professor Chen whispered to Carlos. "He's from your neighborhood, I believe." Incredible natural talent. Carlos studied the boy with new interest. He did look familiar. Perhaps the son of the woman who ran the corner grocery store where Carlos sometimes shopped. Maestro Patel took his position before the young orchestra, raised his baton, and gave the downbeat. The familiar strains of Beethoven's masterpiece filled the ballroom, played with more enthusiasm than precision, but touching nonetheless. The small flutist, Miguel, stepped forward for a solo passage. His clear, pure tones soared above the other instruments, expressing joy so genuine it brought tears to Carlos's eyes. Here was proof of what opportunity could do, a child from his own humble neighborhood, standing on stage in this palace of privilege, creating beauty that transcended all boundaries. When the performance ended, the audience rose in a standing ovation. Carlos stood with them, clapping and wiping away a tear he couldn't hold back. The children beamed with pride, bowing awkwardly but happily. Eleanor Whitfield joined them on stage, putting her arm around young Miguel's shoulders. "This is why we do what we do," she said into the microphone. "Every child deserves the chance to find their voice through music." Carlos nodded in agreement, even as he wondered about all the adults like himself who had never been given that chance. People whose musical voices remained locked inside them, waiting for an opportunity that might never come. As the applause faded and people began to mingle again, Professor Liu turned to Carlos. "Would you play something for us?" Here on the grand piano, Carlos felt his heart skip a beat. "You mean now? In front of everyone?" "Why not?" Professor Diaz joined in. "We've heard from the children. Why not hear from someone who proves it's never too late to pursue your passion?" "I couldn't possibly," Carlos protested, looking around at the glittering crowd, the expensive clothes, the confident faces of people who had never been told they didn't belong. "This is not my world. Music belongs to everyone," Professor Chen said firmly. "That's the whole point of tonight, isn't it?" Before Carlos could respond, she stood and made her way to the stage where Eleanor was speaking with Maestro Patel. The two women conversed for a moment, Eleanor's expression changing from surprise to reluctance to something like resignation. Professor Chen returned to the table, smiling triumphantly. "It's arranged. You'll play after the dessert course." Carlos felt panic rising in his throat. "What? No, I didn't agree to this." "Trust me," she said, patting his hand. "You're ready for this moment." The next 30 minutes passed in a blur. Carlos barely tasted the elaborate chocolate dessert placed before him. His thoughts raced, cycling through all the pieces he knew well enough to play from memory, wondering which might be appropriate for such an audience. And then the moment arrived. The MC returned to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have an unexpected addition to our program tonight. Professor Chen has discovered a remarkable talent right here at the Grand Plaza Hotel. Please welcome to the stage, Mr. Carlos Mendez." A spotlight found Carlos at his table. Polite applause rippled through the ballroom, mixed with curious murmurs. Who was this man no one recognized? Why was he being asked to play? Carlos rose on unsteady legs. Professor Liu gave him an encouraging nod. "Just play from your heart as you did earlier." The walk to the stage felt eternal. Carlos was acutely aware of his worn dress shoes, his simple white shirt without a tie, his calloused hands that marked him as a working man. He felt Eleanor Whitfield's eyes on him as he passed her table, but he didn't dare look her way. When he reached the piano, he took a deep breath and sat down on the bench. The spotlight was blinding, making the audience beyond it just shadowy shapes. Perhaps that was a blessing. He placed his hands on the keys, feeling their cool smoothness beneath his fingers. For a moment, he considered playing the Chopin Nocturne again, the piece that had started this strange day's journey. But no, that was Eleanor's piece, the one she had claimed with her perfect technique and pedigree. Instead, Carlos began to play the Guatemalan folk melody again, the song of his childhood, of his grandfather's guitar, of mountain villages and ancient traditions. He started softly, allowing the gentle notes to float over the hushed ballroom. As he played, Carlos forgot where he was. Forgot the wealthy audience, the intimidating setting, the morning's humiliation. He remembered instead his mother's kitchen, filled with the scent of corn tortillas and the sound of his grandfather's rough voice singing along with his guitar. He remembered the pure joy he had felt as a child, listening to music that seemed to capture all the beauty and sorrow of life in a simple melody. His fingers moved with growing confidence, adding harmonies and variations he had developed over years of playing this piece. The tune swelled and diminished, telling a story without words, a story of loss and hope, of struggle and perseverance, of finding beauty in unexpected places. When the final notes faded away, Carlos kept his eyes closed for a moment longer, reluctant to return to reality. The silence stretched and his heart sank. Had he misjudged? Had his simple folk melody seemed amateur and out of place among the classical masterpieces of the evening? Then the applause began, tentative at first, then growing stronger. Carlos opened his eyes to see people rising from their seats, clapping with genuine appreciation. Some had tears in their eyes, touched by the raw emotion of his playing. Among those standing was Eleanor Whitfield. Her face showed none of the dismissive disdain from that morning. Instead, she looked thoughtful, perhaps even moved. Carlos stood and bowed awkwardly, unused to such attention. As he straightened, he caught Eleanor's eye. Something passed between them, not quite understanding, not quite forgiveness, but an acknowledgement. A recognition that perhaps they had both misjudged each other. The applause continued as Carlos made his way back to his table. People reached out to touch his arm as he passed, murmuring congratulations and praise. By the time he returned to his seat, his cheeks were flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and pride. "That was extraordinary," Professor Liu said, squeezing his shoulder. "You have a rare gift, my friend." Carlos shook his head, still overwhelmed. "I just play what I feel." "And that," said Professor Chen, "is exactly what makes it art rather than mere technique." As the evening began to wind down, guests starting to say their goodbyes and collect their coats, Carlos noticed Eleanor Whitfield approaching their table. He straightened in his chair, unsure what to expect. She stopped before him, her expression composed but no longer cold. "Mr. Mendez," she said, "your performance was unexpected." "Thank you, Mrs. Whitfield," Carlos replied, determined to be gracious despite their earlier encounter. "No, I should thank you," she said, surprising him. "You've reminded me of something important tonight." She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "Music isn't just about technical proficiency. It's about conveying feeling, isn't it? About connecting with something beyond ourselves." Carlos nodded slowly. "That's all I've ever wanted from it." Eleanor studied him for a moment longer. "We should talk more about your musical background. Perhaps tomorrow? I believe you work mornings at the hotel." "Yes, ma'am. Every day from 4 until noon. Then perhaps we could meet at 1. In the hotel cafe?" Carlos blinked in surprise. "Of course. I'd be honored." Eleanor gave a small nod, then turned to greet the professors at the table. Carlos sat back in his chair, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The woman who had humiliated him that morning was now inviting him for a conversation about music, speaking to him as if he were worthy of her time and attention. The world, it seemed, could change in unexpected ways, all because of a piano and the courage to play it. Carlos barely slept that night. He lay awake in his small apartment, replaying the events of the day in his mind. The humiliation of the morning, the unexpected invitation to the gala, and most astonishing of all, his performance on the grand piano before an audience of the city's elite. Each time he remembered the applause, a warm glow spread through his chest. For the first time in his life, his music had been truly heard. And now Eleanor Whitfield wanted to meet with him. The same woman who had looked at him with such disdain just hours earlier. What could she possibly want to discuss? When his alarm buzzed at 3:30 a.m., Carlos rose and prepared for work as usual. His body moved through the familiar routine: shower, coffee, simple breakfast, bus ride to the hotel, while his mind continued to wonder about the afternoon's meeting. He arrived at the Grand Plaza at his usual time and began his morning cleaning routine. The ballrooms needed extra attention after the previous night's gala. Carlos pushed his cart through the crystal ballroom, collecting discarded programs and wiping down surfaces. But he paused when he reached the stage. The grand piano was still there, its cover now closed, waiting to be returned to wherever it had come from. Carlos glanced around to make sure he was alone, then gently lifted the cover and ran his fingers lightly over the keys without pressing them. The memory of playing this instrument before a room full of people still seemed like a dream. "You're here early." Carlos turned with a start. Eleanor Whitfield stood in the doorway, wearing a casual but clearly expensive outfit, tailored pants and a silk blouse rather than last night's evening gown. "Mrs. Whitfield," Carlos said, quickly closing the piano cover. "I'm sorry, I was just—" She waved away his apology. "It's fine. The piano belongs to the foundation, not me personally." She walked into the room, her heels clicking on the polished floor. "I couldn't sleep, so I thought I'd come in early to handle some paperwork from the gala. I didn't expect to find anyone here. I work the morning shift," Carlos explained. 4 to noon, every day. Eleanor nodded, studying him with the same thoughtful expression she'd worn at the end of the previous night. I remember now. You mentioned that. An awkward silence fell between them. Carlos returned to his cleaning cart, unsure what else to say. You know, Eleanor said finally, I've been thinking about your playing. The folk melody. It stayed with me all night. Carlos paused, surprised. Thank you. I've studied piano since I was 5 years old, she continued. The best teachers, the finest instruments, competitions, recitals, a degree from the conservatory, all the advantages. Carlos nodded, not sure where she was going with this. And yet, Eleanor said, her voice softening, I'm not sure I've ever played with the kind of feeling you showed last night, the raw emotion of it. She looked away toward the windows where early morning light was just beginning to glow. It made me wonder what I've been missing all these years. Carlos felt a strange shift in the air between them, as if some invisible barrier had begun to dissolve. Music speaks differently through different people, he said carefully. We each bring our own life to it. Eleanor turned back to him. Yes, exactly. And your life? It's been very different from mine, hasn't it? Yes, ma'am. Very different. She walked closer to where he stood. Tell me how you learned to play. Really learned, not just the basics from videos. Carlos leaned against his cart, considering how to answer. It's hard to explain. I watched tutorials, yes, and I practiced finger positions even without a real piano at first. But mostly, I listened. To recordings, to live performances when I could afford tickets to the community concerts. I tried to understand what the music was saying, what the composer might have felt. And the folk melody? Your grandfather taught you that? Carlos nodded, surprised she had remembered that detail from his brief introduction the night before. He played guitar, not piano. I adapted it myself over the years, added harmonies, variations. It became a way to remember him, I guess, to keep something of my childhood alive. Eleanor was silent for a moment, her eyes studying his face with new interest. Would you show me? How you adapted it? Carlos glanced at the piano, then at his watch. I still have a lot of cleaning to do before the day staff arrives. I'll speak to Mr. Reynolds, Eleanor said decisively. This is more important. Before Carlos could protest, she had taken out her phone and made a quick call. After a brief conversation, she slipped the phone back into her pocket. It's arranged. You're excused from your duties until 9. Now please show me what you did with the melody. Still somewhat dazed by this turn of events, Carlos followed Eleanor to the piano. They sat side by side on the bench, and he began to explain how he had transformed a simple guitar tune into a piano piece, demonstrating the original melody, then the harmonies he had added, the variations he had developed. You did this without formal training in music theory? Eleanor asked, watching his hands move across the keys. I picked up bits and pieces over the years, Carlos admitted. Books from the library, online articles, but mostly I just experimented until I found what sounded right to my ear. That's remarkable, Eleanor said. And there was no condescension in her voice now, only genuine admiration. You have an instinctive understanding of structure and harmony that many trained musicians would envy. Carlos felt his cheeks warm at the praise. It's just something I love. When you love something, you find a way to learn it even without teachers or proper tools. Eleanor was quiet for a moment, her fingers absently tracing patterns on the edge of the piano. I think I've forgotten what it means to play for love alone, she said finally. Everything became about perfection, about impressing others, about living up to expectations. It's never too late to find that joy again, Carlos said gently. Eleanor looked at him, really looked at him, as if seeing past the janitor's identity that had defined him in her eyes until now. No, I suppose it isn't. She straightened on the bench. Play with me, a duet? I don't read music well enough for most duets, Carlos admitted. Then we'll improvise. I'll start a simple chord progression and you join in when you feel it. She began to play, a gentle sequence of chords that created a melancholy but hopeful atmosphere. Carlos listened for a few measures, feeling the rhythm and mood, then joined with a melody that seemed to emerge from the harmonies she had established. They played together for several minutes, neither speaking, building, and developing musical ideas in wordless conversation. Sometimes Carlos led, introducing a new theme or variation. Sometimes Eleanor took the lead, changing the harmonic direction or tempo. Throughout there was a sense of discovery, of two people finding common ground in a language beyond words. When they finally ended with a quiet, resolved chord, the silence that followed felt charged with new understanding. That, Eleanor said softly, is what I've been missing. The rest of the morning passed in continued musical exploration. Eleanor shared some of her classical training, explaining concepts Carlos had discovered on his own but never named. Carlos, in turn, showed her how to loosen her rigid technique, how to feel the music rather than just execute it perfectly. At 8:30, they were interrupted by Mr. Reynolds, who entered the ballroom with a confused expression. "Mrs. Whitfield, your husband has arrived. He's looking for you." "Thank you, Mr. Reynolds. Tell him I'll be right there." Eleanor turned to Carlos as the manager left. "Our official meeting is still set for 1 o'clock, but I think we've already accomplished more than I hoped." Carlos nodded, still somewhat overwhelmed by the morning's unexpected turn. "I should get back to work." "Yes, of course." Eleanor stood from the piano bench. "But Carlos, thank you for reminding me why I began playing in the first place." "And thank you," he replied, "for listening, really listening." She smiled, a genuine smile that transformed her face, softening the polished perfection into something more human. "I'll see you at 1. We have more to discuss." After she left, Carlos returned to his cleaning duties, his mind spinning with possibilities. What more could there be to discuss? He didn't dare hope for anything specific, but for the first time in many years, he felt a door opening to a future he had never imagined possible. At noon, his shift ended, and Carlos went to the employee locker room to freshen up before his meeting with Eleanor. He changed into a clean shirt he had brought, combed his hair, and studied his reflection in the small mirror above the sink. The face that looked back at him was the same as yesterday, lined with age and work, marked by a life of struggle and sacrifice. But the eyes were different. They held a spark that hadn't been there before, a quiet hope that perhaps it wasn't too late for dreams after all. At 5 minutes to 1, Carlos walked into the hotel cafe. Eleanor was already there, seated at a corner table with her husband, a tall man with silver hair and a thoughtful expression. Carlos approached hesitantly, unsure of the protocol for such a situation. Eleanor saw him and waved him over. "Carlos, please join us. I've been telling my husband about your remarkable talent." Thomas Whitfield stood and extended his hand. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Mendez. My wife has been quite moved by your playing." Carlos shook the offered hand, feeling strangely like he had stepped into an alternate reality, where wealthy patrons treated hotel janitors as equals. "The pleasure is mine, sir." "Please sit," Thomas said, gesturing to an empty chair. "We have a proposition we'd like to discuss with you." Carlos sat down, his heart beginning to race. "A proposition?" Eleanor leaned forward, her eyes bright with purpose. "Carlos, how would you feel about teaching?" "Teaching?" Carlos repeated, his coffee cup suspended halfway to his lips. "Me?" Eleanor nodded, her eyes bright with excitement. "Yes. After what I witnessed this morning, your natural ability to communicate musical concepts, your patience in explaining your process, I believe you have a gift for teaching as well as playing." Carlos set his cup down carefully. "But I have no qualifications. No degree, no formal training. Sometimes the best teachers are those who had to struggle to learn," Thomas Whitfield said, his deep voice thoughtful. "They understand the challenges in a way that those who found it easy never can." "Besides," Eleanor added, "you wouldn't be teaching advanced theory or classical performance. We have something else in mind." Carlos looked between them, still trying to process this unexpected turn. Just 2 days ago, he had been nothing more to these people than the man who cleaned their event spaces. Now they were discussing his future, as if it held possibilities beyond mop buckets and cleaning solutions. "Our foundation runs several community music programs," Thomas explained. "Most focus on traditional classical training for children who can't afford private lessons. But we've been discussing a new initiative, one aimed at adults in underserved communities who never had the opportunity to learn music as children." "People like me," Carlos said softly. "Exactly," Eleanor replied. "People who have the desire and often the natural talent, but who were never given the chance. And you think I could teach them?" "Who better?" Eleanor leaned forward, her usual polish giving way to genuine enthusiasm. "You've walked that path yourself. You understand what it takes to learn without advantages, to find beauty and expression against the odds." Carlos looked down at his hands. Workers' hands, calloused from years of manual labor, yet somehow also capable of creating music that had moved even this wealthy, cultured woman. "It's an honor that you would think of me this way," he said. "But I still have my job at the hotel. My responsibilities." "That's part of what we wanted to discuss," Thomas said. "The position would be full-time with benefits. A significant increase from your current salary." Carlos's head snapped up. "Full-time?" Eleanor nodded. "We believe in this program, Carlos. We want to do it right. That means proper compensation for our teachers, not just volunteer work or token payments." I don't know what to say." "Say you'll consider it," Thomas suggested with a gentle smile. "Take some time to think it over. Talk to the professors you met last night. They've agreed to help structure the program and provide mentorship for the teachers we hire." "This isn't charity," Eleanor added, seeming to sense his hesitation. "We're not offering this because we feel sorry for you. We're offering it because we believe you're the right person for this role." Carlos took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing thoughts. "When would this start?" "We're aiming to launch the program in 3 months, Thomas said. "That would give you time to work with the professors on curriculum development, find a replacement for your position here if you decide to accept, and handle any other transitions." "And where would the teaching take place?" "We've secured space in 3 community centers across the city," Eleanor explained, "including one near your neighborhood. The foundation will provide instruments, materials, everything needed." Carlos nodded slowly, the reality of the opportunity beginning to sink in. "May I ask, why are you doing this? Both of you seem so committed to music education. Beyond just typical charity work." Thomas and Eleanor exchanged a look, some unspoken communication passing between them. "My father was a factory worker," Thomas said after a moment. "He loved jazz, could name every musician on every recording, knew all the standards by heart. But he never learned to play, always said it was his biggest regret. And my mother," Eleanor added, "pushed me relentlessly in my piano studies. Excellence was the only acceptable outcome. I lost the joy of music for many years because it became about perfection rather than expression." Her eyes met Carlos's. "Watching you play last night, hearing the story in your music, it reminded me what we're really doing this for." Carlos felt something shift inside him, a recognition that despite the vast differences in their lives, they shared a common understanding of music's true power. "I'll consider it," he said finally. "Thank you for believing I could do something like this." "Excellent," Thomas replied with a smile.
"Take all the time you need."
"Meanwhile, Eleanor has another proposal for you." Carlos turned to her with raised eyebrows. "The foundation is hosting a benefit concert next month," she explained. "I'd like you to perform. Your Guatemalan folk melody and perhaps something else of your choosing." "A real concert? With professional musicians?" "Yes, in fact, Professor Lou has suggested a collaboration. You and he could develop a piece together that combines classical structure with your folk influences." Carlos felt a flutter of both excitement and terror at the prospect. "That sounds terrifying and wonderful." Eleanor laughed, a warm, genuine sound so different from her polite social chuckle. "That's exactly how music should feel sometimes, both terrifying and wonderful." They spoke for another hour, discussing details of both the teaching position and the upcoming concert. By the time they parted ways, Carlos felt as if he had stepped through a doorway into a new world, one where his passion for music wasn't just a private joy, but a gift he could share with others. 6 months later, Carlos stood in a classroom at the East Side Community Center, watching as 8 adults of various ages positioned their hands on the keyboards in front of them. The room was filled with electronic pianos, each student wearing headphones as they practiced. "Remember what we talked about," Carlos said, walking between the rows. "Music isn't just about getting the notes right. It's about finding your own voice, telling your story through sound." He stopped beside an older woman whose gnarled fingers moved slowly but deliberately across the keys. "Beautiful, Mrs. Garcia. I can hear the longing in those phrases." She smiled up at him, her eyes bright with pride. "My grandchildren can't believe their abuela is learning piano at 71. We're never too old to become who we might have been," Carlos replied, quoting George Eliot, one of many things he had learned in the past months of working with the professors. At the end of the lesson, the students removed their headphones and gathered their belongings, chatting excitedly about the community concert they were preparing for next month. Nothing fancy, just a simple performance for family and friends. but for many it would be their first time playing music for an audience. As the last student left, Carlos began tidying the room. His life had transformed so completely in half a year that sometimes he still couldn't believe it. The teaching position had indeed been full-time, allowing him to leave his janitorial job. His salary had nearly doubled, and for the first time in his life he had health insurance and paid vacation days. More importantly, he had purpose. Each day he helped people like himself, those who had carried a love for music in their hearts for years without having the means to express it. Some were retired, finally finding time to pursue old dreams. Others were middle-aged, like him, discovering that it wasn't too late to learn something new. A few were younger adults who had missed opportunities earlier in life due to poverty or circumstance. All of them reminded Carlos of himself, sitting at that community center piano after work, teaching his calloused fingers to create beauty. The benefit concert Eleanor had mentioned had been a turning point. Carlos had performed his folk melody, of course, but also a new piece he had developed with Professor Liu, a fusion of classical piano techniques with the rhythms and melodies of his Guatemalan heritage. The audience's response had been overwhelming, leading to more performance opportunities and even a small recording contract with a local label that specialized in world music. But teaching remained his primary focus and his greatest joy. Nothing compared to the moment when a student progressed from mechanical repetition to true expression, when they stopped playing notes and started making music. Carlos locked the classroom and headed for the exit. Outside, the evening was cool and clear, the first stars appearing in the darkening sky. A familiar car was parked by the curb, Eleanor's sleek silver sedan. She rolled down the window as he approached. "How was class today?" "Wonderful," Carlos replied with a genuine smile. "Mrs. Garcia is finally feeling the music instead of just playing it." And Mr. Tanaka composed his own little piece for his granddaughter's birthday. Eleanor's face lit up. "That's fantastic. Are you ready for dinner? Thomas is meeting us at the restaurant." Monthly dinners with the Whitfields had become another unexpected part of Carlos's new life. What had begun as professional meetings to discuss the program had evolved into a genuine friendship. Despite their different backgrounds, they had found common ground in their passion for making music accessible to everyone. "Just let me grab my bag from the office," Carlos said. As he walked back into the building, he passed the community center's main hall, where a grand piano sat on a small stage. It wasn't as magnificent as the Steinway from the hotel gala, but it was well maintained and had a warm, resonant tone. Carlos paused, remembering that morning nearly 7 months ago when he had dared to touch a piano that seemed far beyond his station in life. How quickly the world could change when someone finally heard the music you'd been carrying inside you all along. He collected his bag and rejoined Eleanor, sliding into the passenger seat of her car. "I've been thinking," she said as they pulled away from the curb. "We should expand the program next year. More locations, more instruments beyond just piano." "I'd like that," Carlos nodded. "Music belongs to everyone, after all." "Yes," Eleanor agreed, a soft smile playing on her lips. "It just took someone like you to remind me of that." As they drove through the city streets, Carlos gazed out at the passing buildings and people. Somewhere in those apartments and houses were more hidden musicians, people with songs in their hearts but no way to let them out. People who, like him, just needed someone to listen, to really listen, and recognize the beauty they had to offer. Thanks to one moment of courage at a piano he wasn't supposed to touch, some of those people would now have their chance to be heard, and that, Carlos thought, was the most beautiful music of all.